Welcome, everybody. My name is Marcelite, and I will be presenting about my undergraduate honors thesis entitled Behavioral Reaction of African Elephants to Vehicles in the Okavango Delta, Botswana. So before delving into the specifics of my research, I wanted to start with some background that's pertinent to this study. In modern day conservation, wildlife tourism or ecotourism is increasingly receiving attention as an activity with the potential to support conservation work. It's thought that wildlife tourism can support conservation work by promoting awareness amongst wildlife tourists about conservation work, while also providing a source of funding for conservation work. Additionally, it's been shown that wildlife tourism can provide jobs and revenue streams to the communities that it occurs in, and this can help generate interest and support from those communities for these conservation initiatives. However, we do have to consider that tourism within the environment does represent an environmental disturbance, and that begs us to ask the question, what is the impact on the wildlife of this disturbance? So some past study has already established that there are negative effects of tourism on wildlife. This has been found in a whole myriad of species, from stingrays to polar bears to penguins. But specifically looking at elephants, there's been very little study. There was a study in Asian elephants that did find that there was a greater duration and frequency of alert, fear, stress, and aggressive behaviors in those Asian elephants in response to vehicles being in their environment. And there's also been 2 studies published on African elephants. One found that there was increased physiological stress markers when tourist pressure was higher, and another found that there was more elephant to elephant, so conspecific aggression in African elephants when tourist pressure was higher. So in my specific case, I conducted my study in the Southeast Okavango Delta, which is in the sub-Saharan African nation of Botswana. It's an inland delta ecosystem that is home to a population of over 130,000 elephants. So this incredibly large population of elephants makes it an ideal place to conduct research on elephants. Its abundance of wildlife and pristine location also makes it the premier place for wildlife tourism in Botswana, which includes both photographic tourism and trophy hunting tourism. Additionally, communities do live within the Okavango Delta and they cohabitate with elephants there, which historically has caused some significant human-wildlife conflict. In the case of elephants, oftentimes it's conflict over crop raiding and water resources, and it's led to generally negative views of elephants by communities. So this confluence of tourism, elephants, and communities all interacting here, especially from vehicles, as most of the tourism here is done from safari vehicles, makes this a great place to look at this question of wildlife and tourism disturbance. So in looking at the objectives, I first and foremost set out to characterize and sample the elephant population in my study areas. I did that looking at sex and age, and then also to observe and record behavioral responses of the elephants I sampled to the vehicles, and then statistically examine the connections between sex, age, and the distance of the vehicle from the elephants in connection to the behavioral responses observed. And goals with these objectives were to promote safer and more respectful interactions between vehicles and elephants, additionally to examine the possible stress that these vehicles may be placing on elephants, or if alternatively, this population may be becoming increasingly habituated to vehicles as they're in their environment. And to also identify if there's higher concern elephant demographics, so higher concern sex or age categories that may need to be given greater care when vehicles are around them because they show a higher likelihood of having these behaviors. So in wanting to examine all these variables, I created 3 hypotheses. My first hypothesis concerning age was that subadults were going to have a greater likelihood of aggression when compared to adults. There's a couple reasons I hypothesized this. For female subadults, it's going to be probably their first time in their subadult years having a calf and rearing a calf. So this maternal inexperience could translate to more reactivity towards perceived threats in the environment. For male subadult elephants, they are usually exiting the maternal herd in their subadult years, and so they go through a period of social instability where they don't have the comfort and security of that group environment, and so they may be more aggressive and reactive in general because of that lack of group safety. And then for both sexes, just because of their relative age and inexperience, they still have an evolving understanding of predatory threats, which could include the threat that vehicles might pose to them. And the older elephants may have gotten to a place where they've had enough experience with vehicles that they don't see them as a threat, while the subadults do. For sex, I hypothesized that females were going to have a greater likelihood of reacting to vehicles than males. This was due to the fact that females are almost exclusively present in family groups with young in the environment, and so they have that protective maternal instinct towards the young. And I just hypothesized this as a greater likelihood of reaction because I felt that this protectiveness could manifest as any of our focal behavior types, whether that be fearfulness, running away, just greater vigilance, watching out for the threat of vehicles in the environment, or aggression to warn vehicles off from the young. And finally, when looking at distance, I hypothesized that there's going to be a greater likelihood of stress-related behavior with a closer distance of the vehicle. This seems pretty obvious, as closer distance would probably increase the threat that the elephant feels with that vehicle being in its space. But it was also based on a finding from the study on the Asian elephants I mentioned earlier that did find all of those behaviors increased with closer distance of vehicles. So with my methodology, I undertook the study from February to May 2022 in 5 geographically proximate study areas in the Okavango Delta, as I said. Data was collected during herbivore sampling transects, so we were out otherwise collecting data for herbivore population sampling. But while we were out doing those transects, we also stopped and collect behavioral data on elephants. The methodology for the design did also allow for opportunistic collection, so that would be when we were driving within the study areas, but not actively transecting. We still allowed to stop if elephants were observed and take that behavioral data. And behavioral data was taken with a catalog called an ethogram of individual behaviors. And those individual behaviors then were further categorized into what I call behavior type categories. The umbrella category being just a reaction or no reaction. So if the elephant displayed any of the focal behaviors in the ethogram, they were given a reaction. And then individual behaviors were further categorized into aggressive, vigilant, or fearful behaviors. Then statistically, I created what are called generalized linear mixed effects regression models. Basically, a glimmer model, as they're abbreviated, looks at the relationship between a binary response variable and multiple predictor variables, but taking into consideration what a random effect could have, so a random effect would be essentially something that could have an impact on the predictor variables, as the predictor variables are assumed to be independent, but the random effect takes away that assumption of independence of that variable from the predictor variables. So my predictor variables were age, sex, and distance of the vehicle from the elephant, and the response variable was the behavioral reaction for whichever model. So I created 4 models for each behavioral type, and that was considered a binary, just yes or no, did it occur in this elephant or did it not? And then the random effect was group number. So group number was the unique identifying number given to elephants that were found in a group. So all elephants in a group together could all have a 1 or a 2, depending on separate groups. And that was included as a random effect with the assumption that essentially the behavior of an elephant in a group could impact the behavior of another elephant in the same group. So they're not independently separated necessarily in the variables. And then the output of the model, odds ratios, and confidence intervals were used to identify statistically significant relationships. So when looking at the results for age, I found that subadults had a higher likelihood of any sort of reaction, but particularly the aggressive reactive category. And this supported my initial hypothesis. For sex, males had a higher likelihood of reaction, and this did not support my initial hypothesis. And then for distance, there was a greater likelihood of all stress-related behaviors, so reaction and all three of the subcategories with closer distance. And this supported my initial hypothesis. So in examining why I got the results I did, the distance and age results were expected and can be explained by my reasoning for their initial hypotheses. But the sex results differed. So my hypothesis predicted that females were going to show this higher reactivity, while actually, in actuality, the results showed that males had this higher reactivity. And I felt this could possibly be explained by female biology and ecology. So females are generally in some sort of stage of the lactation or pregnancy cycle, the majority of their subadult and adult life, which means that they have higher nutritional requirements than males. So I felt that this might be able to lead to female unwillingness to abandon foraging to react to the vehicle, as it has a higher cost to them to have this kind of reaction and abandoning the foraging that they need for that higher nutritional requirement. Additionally, because they have that higher nutritional requirement, they tend to have a transient feeding pattern, as they like to go through an environment rapidly picking out the highest quality forage and quickly move on. So it's also possible that we simply just had less interaction time between the vehicles and the female elephants as they were transiently moving through the environment. So we had less time to observe any sort of reaction they might have to the vehicle. So in considering just some of the limitations and ideas I would have for future study, I will say that this should not be taken as being representative of all African elephant populations. There's a lot of African elephant populations in sub-Saharan Africa, and they all do face different environmental pressures. So it's very likely that behavior could vary wildly across different discrete populations. And additionally, my ethogram and study was inclusive of only the focal behaviors chosen, which does not necessarily mean it was inclusive of all significant stress-related behaviors, and we could have missed observing behaviors that did indicate stress. And finally, the data collection parameters of when we were collecting data probably don't necessarily accurately emulate tourist interactions. We were only one vehicle, and we observed, especially in transect, pretty low speed and noise requirements, whereas in tourist interactions, there can be multiple vehicles. There's less stringent rules about how loud people are, how fast the cars are going. So it's possible that our study kind of undervalued what reactions elephants might have when the pressures are greater. So in thinking of these limitations, I think a great next step would be a replication of the study, but doing behavioral observation of actual interactions between tourist vehicles and elephants. And additionally, a study that would look at parameters for what the impact of vehicle speed, distance, and number may have on the reactions of elephants. But culminating in all of this, my recommendations based on these findings would be that males and subadults are given more space when viewed, or they are opted to not be viewed at all and instead view female groups. But if stress-related behaviors are noticed in these elephants, to increase the distance of the vehicles away to minimize the stress that may be placed on the elephants and the possibility of a harmful reaction from them. And I'd like to acknowledge all of these people and organizations in helping me create this thesis and ask if there's any questions.